Welcome to Sex Tells, the podcast where we fundamentally are just normalising the conversations we're not having enough of, really. And today we're going to be talking about one of those conversations, which is sex and ageing, something that every one of us experiences, yet so often in silence or shame. We're definitely sort of sold ideas that desire expires, that aging bodies are problems that need to be fixed, or that great sex sadly only belongs to the young. And today I'm going to be joined by Julie Sale, who is a COSRT senior accredited sex and relationship psychotherapist and director of the Contemporary Institute of Clinical Sexology, and also just a very interesting person. So, together, we're going to be exploring how sexuality changes across the lifespan. So, welcome, Julie. So brilliant to have you.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate that.
So, first of all, I think we're just going to kind of kick off with a big question, really, which is how have you yourself experienced, sex and aging? I suppose on a personal level, but also in a professional level, within your work.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for asking me
It's a
that.
big one, yeah.
It is. And, of course, the white hair that I have here is indicating that I am becoming older and I'm heading into that category, which stirs up all sorts of things for me. I think where your question lands for me is there's a it's got a dual track of the impact of ageism. I think in white Western culture, we have an ageist culture where judgments are made of people simply because they're older. And we'll talk more about that, I'm sure, as we go through. And they're not typically positive, whereas there's some cultures that really honour their older people. And I don't think white Western culture does. So it falls there for me in terms of general ageism. In terms of professionally, the narrative in psychosexual therapy, the presumption would be that as people get older, their interest in sex declines, their functional capability declines. And although that can be true, it can also really mask and erase the opposite experience that people are having, which is that they become more sexual. And I think that fits with ageism because no one wants to think that older people are sexual, right? And the other track on all of that for me is credibility. So if I think about this in the combination of me as an individual and my professional activities, I'm I'm aware that as I age, will I be still perceived to be a credible voice as a principal of a sex therapy organization simply because I'm older? Will I be will my client base change simply because I'm getting older? What's that about? So yeah, ageism, um, presumption, and all of the presumption that comes within our profession around sex and aging, and what aging does to credibility. That's where my mind goes. In other cultures, the older you get, the higher your sense of credibility becomes. I don't think that's the case in our culture, specifically for women.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, talking about the cultural aspect of it is really, really important. And certainly, as you say, in Western culture, we're minimized and invisible. But what's very compounded by that is what you're talking, and women particularly. Women really, like certainly, I mean, I've just turned 50, but certainly at the kind of, 40 point, you're noticing your potential expiry date for sure.
Mm. Yeah, it's horrible to think in that way, isn't it? But I think that that can be a reality for some of us, for sure.
Yeah, and it is, and I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because it is horrible to think in that way. And again, I'm a sex and relationship therapist, and I work hard to, move away from those kind of scripts and that, that feeling that puts onto me. But I'm human, and I of course experience that as well, that invisibility and that sort of erosion of. But it's interesting also what you're talking about in terms of work, because actually in work I've become more credible because of my age, and I'm somebody to talk to, and I'm somebody that comes with experience, even if that wasn't necessarily the case.
I agree, and I think in our profession of psychotherapy in general, being a bit older does um, have that connection to credibility. I'm just aware of how much older, especially in psychosexual therapy, whether there's a tipping point where you where that credibility starts shifting because of the presumptions that, what would they know about sex if they're older? Well, quite a lot, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, exactly. So I suppose the question is then, so what might actually people come into therapy for, that is age related, or, quote unquote age related, or might not be necessarily obvious that it's age related?
Yeah, I guess in psychosexual therapy, the obvious things that people come into therapy for that are age related are those age connected functional difficulties that people can face. So that does exist, that is real. So we can have people coming into therapy with changes in their levels of interest in sex and some sexual function problems. So uh, which can be age related. In our profession, we're far more connected to the medical experience and the biological experience for our clients than maybe we are when we're working in general psychotherapy, because there are different biological causes for sexual function problems. So we're going to have hormonal changes as we age. We're going to have other health related issues that could have nothing to do with sexual anatomy, but could influence sexual interest, like pain or mobility issues. And classically, in people with penises, there might be some problems with erections. And for people with vulvas and vaginas, there might be problems with dryness and therefore pain. So they're the kind of classic sexual function problems that can show with age. I think what we don't talk about is the other stuff that comes up in our work, which is an increase in desire. It's a lot about decrease in desire, especially for women at menopause. And no one really talks about how changes in hormones and context can actually significantly increase sexual desire. And it can, and that person might not be partnered, or they might have a lot of desire, but not for the person they're with. So it's starting to create some disruption in the relationship. So there's those things to think about. What happens when we start really connecting to a reality that our life is limited, and there's a deadline that none of us know about. We don't know when it is, but we all know it's going to happen at some point. We're going to die. So when we're at that stage of life when we're facing that, we could be thinking about what's left that I haven't expressed yet. I want my life to be different. I want to have more pleasure, and that can create all sorts of disruptions that people seek therapeutic help for.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really important one, and one that just, yeah, isn't spoken about. That, again, we talk about menopause or perimenopause, and going through this big dip, but yeah, there is a really large spike, and also compounded, as you say, by, a potential expiry date. I want to live, and I want to get those, thrill seeking, and I see lots of people that come into therapy in their mid 40s, women that come in their 40s, wanting to experiment more, or thinking about their sexuality, not quite understanding what that's about. So yeah, I think that's a really important point, and one that we're just not having a big enough discussion about. It's all mid 40s and HRT, and it's all quite negative, and all of the negative elements of that, when actually this could also be a time of liberation.
Yes, and frustration because
Yes, yeah.
as desire's increased and the accessibility for that expression isn't there. This
And
can
has
come up in
decreased. Mm.
yes. So this can come up in kink sexualities that have always been kind of suppressed or sidelined, and it can come up in same-sex sexual attraction that's been a part of a person's life, or other sex gender sexual attraction that hasn't been experienced in life. Because we have a monogamy culture, don't we? In white Western culture is a monogamy culture, which means that however you identify in terms of your sexual orientation, if you don't have an agreement that is non-monogamous, and they obviously exist, and lots of people live in a polyamorous or consensual non-monogamous relationship structure, but the dominant relationship style is monogamy. Your sexual orientation or your sexual preferences get locked in with the person that you've made your life with or you're having your partnership with. And again, later in life, it can be those moments of, I've missed all of that out. I, how do I get some of that? And is it too late? So I have I have women presenting in therapy with a frustrated same-sex sexual desire. And we know from research that the sexual fluidity in women is quite pronounced. And there are also, multiple different genders and, types of people who are coming to therapy been you in grief of what they've missed out on in terms of sexual expression, and experimentation.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So what do you think sort of people struggle most to say out loud, about sex and aging?
I think people struggle to talk about sex in our culture anyway,
Yeah, definitely. We're doing better. We're doing better.
but I think we're a little bit, I think the better can show up in, um, an uber sex positive, um, anything goes. We can talk about anything. We're all liberated over here on this end of the scale, or a Channel 4 documentary style on, on something that a sexual expression that's um, has a little bit of voyeuristic interest for people. So it can be a little bit kind of over.
Intimidating almost as
Yes,
well,
and into
can't
an
it?
extreme. And I think the relational piece can get lost in that. Um, and I mean, I'm a sex therapist myself, and I still can find it difficult. I talk about sex all the time with people all the time. And it's different when I'm talking to partners about that. There's a different dimension to those personal conversations. We can still, even though talking about sex and sexual expression is my day job, I can still appreciate how hard it can be to talk about that when it's your life, when it's your partners, and the stakes are high in that. So I don't think we're talking about sex. I appreciate there's more openness now. So it's that. I think for me, your question lands in different places depending on who I'm thinking about isn't asking the question. So if I think about what wouldn't a person of my age want to say about sex, what would be inhibiting them? It's all of the shame related narratives. Feel ashamed because they want sex. They feel ashamed because they don't want sex. A- Ageism is internalized. So we might be judging the state of our own bodies and thinking that our bodies are disgusting because they're not youthful anymore. That's very common. Body image and sexual confidence are really connected, aren't they?
Absolutely.
And not being able to say that you don't find your partner sexually attractive anymore because their bodies have changed, or you believe they don't find you attractive because your body's changed. There's a lot of shame and ageism connected to this, the inhibition to talk about sex, I think. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, 100%. And I was having a conversation with somebody recently actually about sort of the shame of lube, for example. And, this, I kind of got into a conversation with somebody about it, and just sort of saying I would be so disinterested in a woman, if they needed to lubricate. And just, yeah, just the weight of that, and having to feel that you hide that, and that actually, you know, we should all be using it anyway. Why would you not want to be, increasing pleasure and decreasing friction? All of those sorts of brilliant things that lubrication does. But yeah, the shame around actually the biological aspects of aging, and feeling that that has to be hidden in some way, and that be then a bit barrier to having sex, because you don't even want to have that conversation. There's so much shame around it.
And if you do and you don't have the conversation, you have pain.
Yeah,
So, that kind of comment goes straight to the heart of the problem, which is heteronormative assumptions about
absolutely.
sex and relationships. And what I mean by heteronormative is um, assumptions that are embedded in heterosexuality that are not thought about, discussed, or unpacked. They just get into the narrative. They really badly affect heterosexual people. We talk a lot about how normativities affect marginalized people, but heteronormative scripts really badly affect heterosexual people. What about straight men who are kinky? What about um, straight men who like anal penetration with their female partners? Um, it all goes into a taboo and into a problem space. And this, if we unpack that idea of that conversation you were in, where a person said they'd be put off if their female partner needed lubrication, it's a real full kind of full stop pause moment. We go, what do you mean? What are you making lubrication mean? What are you making it mean? And if we flip it, if a person with a penis struggles with erections, which is devastating for people with penises, the kind of equivalent would be, oh, a woman saying to a man, I don't want it to do with you if your penis goes soft. Do you know what I mean?
Julie, I posed that question. I
Right.
posed that question. So yeah, exactly that. And it hadn't even occurred.
It's so embedded, isn't it?
So embedded. It's so embedded. And I'm actually, funny enough, the kind of next podcast I'm going to be doing is a woman that is trying to break down taboos about lube. And has set up her own lube company, because of off of the back of those comments, I was like, I really want to talk to somebody and get to the grips with breaking down stigma and taboos about lube. Like, this is insane. But yeah, but like you say, it cuts right to the heart of it, doesn't it?
It really does. And to balance this out so that it doesn't look like, a feminist agenda. Yeah, not that I've got an issue with a feminist agenda, but I also have a tremendous amount of empathy for people who are experiencing unreliable erections and the judgments and expectations that heteronormativity loads on people with penises. I've got a tremendous amount of empathy for that, and I'm equally um, frustrated by straight women who are judging and criticizing their male partners because they've got unreliable erections, because that dynamic is going to perpetuate the unreliable erections. And we've got analogy to vaginas that need lubricating. We've got analogy to soft penises. Like, come on, people. It's more.
Yeah,
We can do better than this. Come on.
yeah, absolutely. It's really it's so interesting talking to you, because immediately my brain's going in 50 different directions about, where we could take, but I'll try and keep it succinct, because we'll be here all day. Um what so I mean, we've touched on some of those areas, but from your point of view, if you were to try and succinctly package it up almost, what is the sort of idea that where is sort of the idea that sex has an expiry date ultimately come from?
Yeah. I think it comes from the fact that humans have an expiry date. It's an expiry date. So there's a sense of things will end. It's fair and true to say that as we develop in life, our ability to do things, all things, can be affected, decline at some stage. So that's all fair. Our eyesight's likely to decline. You know, our physical mobility, our cognitive ability. It's part of I keep going like that because it's like a cycle of life, isn't it? And that's all fair. But for me, it's more around the mythology of later relationships and sex in later life. And for me, it all starts coalescing around ageism and how we as a culture judge and assess older people and how we think about ourselves and other people and their bodies and desire in an older person. It's almost like it's inappropriate for an older person to want sex. And we might just be able to tolerate an older man, but then he might be the dirty old man in the care home. But, woe betide the idea that an older lady would like sex. So all the gender roles come in. So I think part of it is reality that things will change as we age. And part of it is our terrible attitude to aging.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. What in terms of kind of, the idea that do you think that we've replaced kind of the idea of sex stops with sort of pressure to stay sexually young forever? Or that there's a potential for liberation to feel like pressure, perhaps? Does
Yes.
that make sense?
It does. It's kind of the opposite end of the coin, isn't it? When we're talking about all of these, presumptions that sex will decline. And then there's that other side of public narratives around sex, which say we are supposed to say physically young and not decline in any way because, that's not, well, good luck with that because that's possible. A good decline is going to happen at some stage. Um, there's that side, and with that can come that kind of pressure. I agree that can happen. So it's no surprise that people opt out. Pressure, psychological pressure around sex is a turn off. It leads to obligatory sex, which is the worst sex in the world, where you have sex as an obligation, not as a pleasure. And it contributes to relationship difficulties. So I think that can happen. I think you can end up in almost like a inevitable cul-de-sac of a mix of the narratives in society. You're an older person, you shouldn't want sex. However, you're not allowed to get old. So you need to stay young, all of that knottiness. I'm a real believer. In our school, we talk about the person in front of you, what are their desires, their interests, where are they at, how do they want to live? Let's let's unpack all the shoulds. Let's get from under the shoulds. Should be like this, should be that. So what do you really want? What do you want? And let's work back from there.
I mean, again, we've touched on it, but why do you think that aging for women has got such more of a negative connotation and characterization than for men, particularly? And I suppose as a follow on from that is therefore what is then the impact for us all? If that's how the lens that we're looking through.
Yeah. Well, I think it's about sexism and misogyny. I think it's built into our culture. And again, I'm not speaking from an uber political position on that. It's just a realism.
Yeah,
You were talking
absolutely.
there about, as a sex therapist, you were saying earlier that advocating to unpack dominant social messages, but you're in this world yourself. It would be, it would be, it would just be unethical and inappropriate to not acknowledge the systems that we're in. When we are in a society that doesn't value women in the same way as it values men, and where beauty standards are still, and it's not as binary as when I was younger, but beauty standards are still different for women than they are for men. I think men are included in this now with fitness culture and so on, whereas it wasn't so much before. But I think we have different social standards for men and women, and I think that's where that main problem is. We know that women are treated differently in medicine, and this is without us even getting anywhere near other marginalised identities and how just how disturbing people's treatment is if they don't have a so-called you know, dominant identity. So I do think it still boils down to that in the global position. And we have to think about how much of that we've taken on board ourselves and how much we contribute to it ourselves. And what do we do to challenge it in ourselves so we can challenge it in society? That's kind of where it lands for me.
Yeah, yeah. And I suppose, again, I suppose that again, rooted in this kind of misogyny. But ultimately, yeah, it's about that when mid 40s, early 50s, when you're no longer able to have children, potentially, that's where your use ends. Or historically, that's where the use of women ends, and therefore, the desirability and the sexuality, therefore, doesn't continue after that. I suppose there's also something about that it's also started there or with that idea.
Yeah, and I mean that's horrible to
Say, I know.
it's true, it's horrible to sit with. I think we're not that many generations away from people not living into older age. It feels like a a standard to us in the here and now, but we're not many generations away from old age being, you know, unusual, or old age 50 and women not really people, not living past their fertile phase. But what you're speaking into there is this whole evolutionary biology idea of sex and relationships, which I think is really reductive. It's this idea that sex interest in sex is connected to the reproductive imperative
Yeah, yeah.
because we're mammals, we're animals, blah blah blah. Well, it doesn't stack up in current culture because how many people are selectively not reproducing, how many people are still desire does live beyond our so-called fertile stage. In fact, for some of us, it increases once we've got past that stage. The harm those narratives do to people who want children and can't have them, the harm it does to people who don't want children or are expected to have them.
Mm,
That's a whole pod and book and hours of talking all by itself, isn't it?
yeah, yeah.
The sex is natural idea, and therefore when the reproductive bit ends, it's no longer natural.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a woman that is childless involuntarily, and I talk about that a lot, and I bring that into my work, as well. But certainly, when I gave up on my fertility journey, there was this kind of, I don't know, response, which is, well, think about all the sex that you can now have and how liberated that you can now be, and isn't that wonderful? You can grab something else from, like, again, as though that's all that's important. Yeah. So yes, we won't dive into that because it's a whole another subject matter in itself, but it's an important one to bring up.
Sorry, I just wanted to say how sorry I am that you had those narratives thrown at you, and how yeah, how deeply confronting it is to want a family and not be able to. I don't want to let that moment pass without saying that.
No. I really, really appreciate it. And I talk a lot about it, and I talk a lot. And again, actually, it's probably worth noting on that subject that I did a huge amount of work about helping other women to kind of move into a period of acceptance, and you can accept a life outside of this. But the aging process for me, as I said to you earlier, I hit 50, And I had this other weird wave of, oh, it really is over, which showcased to me that there obviously was this subconscious level of hope somewhere, that even though I wrote and talked about acceptance, maybe somewhere along the line I hadn't, because when I really did get to 50, I was like, oh, that really is the end, and there is a second loss and grief that comes with that, for
Mm.
sure, for
So
sure.
really hear that.
Yeah, yeah. So we were just, we're talking about women. I mean, obviously, one of the things that shows up for me a lot, actually, I'm pleased that it shows up a lot more. I'm pleased that men are coming in for unreliable erections, a lot more and feel able to do that. But how does erectile anxiety shape, men's confidence later in life? I'd be really interested in your experience of that in clinic.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking me to talk about that. I'm really passionate about men and men's sexual health and trans people.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So in my clinical experience, any experience for a person with a penis of them losing their erection at any stage in life has the potential to have a significant impact on them.
Mm.
And it's because, again, culturally, an erect penis says something about virility, masculinity, importance, capability, strength, all of the things that go with masculine codes.
Yeah.
And being able to um, engage in penetrative sex, whether that's a penis in a vagina or a penis in an anus, regardless of sexual orientation, is a standard expectation in sex, and the performance piece is of heavier on people with penises, I would say,
Yes, exactly.
or tops in a gay relationship.
Yeah.
I think it's important to say that the loss of erection through whatever it might be, if it's a little bit too much to drink one night and try penetrative sex and it fails, or anxiety, or the cycle of desire is interrupted. Depending on how that's received by the partner or how it's understood by the individual, can really set a pattern in place. And what I think is absolutely brilliant about our profession is we can resolve that with a person so that the psychological anxiety cycle can be changed. And I'm really sad when men leave it a long time before they come and ask. My experience with this theme is that, and this one I always make a joke of it, is that men would far sooner be told they had heart disease or diabetes than be told there's a
Yeah,
psychological
yeah.
component to their erections. Like, seriously, we can sort the anxiety out by talking to the heart disease is a big thing to be dealing with. So sometimes
Mm-mm.
I prefer a medical cause than a psychological. But once we get them I get them in the room, we can all help. We, as in sex, can help. So I think it's a lifelong risk for men, if there's a change in reliability of erection, or if they have a really disturbing experience. And I really get disturbed and concerned about partner responses to the loss of erection.
Oh, I really do. Yeah. Yeah. I find it very confronting, actually. I do find it very confronting, that it then becomes about them, like, and not necessarily understanding the real weight and the burden and the anxiety and the stress and the loss and the grief that might be happening for that person. But I'm grateful to be able to help them to reframe that, and to give them some space in the therapy space.
That's right. I think I understand some of the emotional responses, because happen is that a partner, regardless of gender, a partner can think, is this about my level of sexual attractiveness?
Yes.
I must have lost their erection because I'm not attractive, I'm not enough. Now, I have empathy for that, especially in the context of aging and all of the weight that everyone's carrying around loss of desirability and credibility as you get older. What I find confronting I think we're sharing a similar thing, is how cruel, I'm going to use the word cruel, how cruelly some people can behave with their partners who are losing their erections. And without, by cruel, I mean very critical or attacking, which we hear in a therapy space. Um, and all that does is perpetuate the problem. I think there's very little awareness of how erections happen biologically in general culture. People with penises and people who have sex with people with penises don't really know how erections happen, and therefore don't know how they get switched off and how they get switched back on again. It's different for a person with a penis as it is with a person with a vulva. And I think, you know, looking up and researching how do erections happen and the process for switching erections on and off can help people understand the biological process that's going on. Any switch in desire is going to potentially trigger the chemical response that switches the process of keeping blood in an erect penis, switches it off, blood's going to drain away and the penis is going to go soft. It's just biology. So if we can get a little bit of psychoed out, a psychoeducation out around that, that's helpful. What I will say about at any age, if and any opportunity to say, if you have a penis and at any age you find that your erections are becoming unreliable, make sure you have a check with your GP on your heart levels, diabetes, testosterone level, because erectile unreliability is a really early sign of health problems. So don't ignore it. Um, and for partners, be compassionate. If you're feeling if you're feeling it's about you and your level of attractiveness, that's for you to work on and work through. But perpetuating the problem with really high emotional moments around erection loss, just it's only going to make things worse. Much as I understand how it's a hot moment.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And, I try and help people to again, think about cultural and social and biological scripts that we've understood and why they might be feeling that way. That it has to be something to do with me. But as you say, ultimately, compounds the problem and creates the anxiety, and then we get in a loop, of withdrawal and minimization of confidence, and then that spirals. So it's about understanding the pattern, like you say, right from you know uh the sort of the education side and sort of the anatomy and what's actually happening from biological side, and right through to then what's now the pattern of behavior that's existing between the two of you. um so I mean, again, we've touched on that, but when sexual difficulties appear with age, what's really going on, beneath the surface? So maybe you can just talk a little bit more about how we as, psychosexual relationship therapists look at that, what lens we look through to understand all of it. So there's obviously some biological things that might be going on, but yeah, then all these other factors at play.
Exactly. You're quite right to reference the biopsychosocial model because sex therapists think about their clients' experiences in that way. So we're going to be looking at any age, we're going to be looking at, are there biological factors here? And as a person ages, the chances of there being biological factors increases. It's just this process. It's not inevitable, but it is an increased potential. So we're looking at heart disease, diabetes, menopause, loss of testosterone, all of those things. Um, in terms of the psychological, and in there I'd put the relational as well. It's about a person's relationship to their own body, to their own sense of desirability, the weight of ageism that goes in that self-criticism of what our bodies look like when we're aging, um, and also the quality of the relationship that they're in. Because if people have if they're in a long-term relationship and they've got to a stage where things are changing around them. Maybe they've had a family and the family have grown up, or they haven't had a family but their careers are changing or they're heading towards retirement. They might find themselves looking at the person or the people they're sharing their lives with and thinking, I'm not sure I want to do this anymore. Right? So questioning again because of the idea of time running out, questioning the quality of the relationship you have.
Absolutely big existential questions. Yeah.
Exactly. And then our work then goes into those life and death existential questions. Um, and around grief and loss. And if a person is losing function or they've lost their partner, my
Mm.
heart absolutely aches for people who've lost a long-term partner um, through illness or old age, and they're not being touched themselves. No one's touching. We're not a tactile society. Well, white Western culture isn't tactile in Britain. So people aren't held. They're not touched, and I think that's where all of this distress comes in.
Yeah. Yeah. The touch is really an important one, actually. I wrote an article about that recently, and also just about platonic touch and the importance of that, and being able to feel connected to other humans. It's at the center. It's our center of gravity, isn't it? As human, we want to be connected to others, and yeah, the loss. I really felt that when you were saying, about the loss and the grief around that. And immediately, actually, I was just thinking about my grandma and how like long she spent on her own and what that must. And again, and we just absorb that as that's, oh well, that's just how it is. She's on her own for 30 years after my grandfather died. Like what a loss.
And being a human, she might have had slightly more chance for touch because somebody might have felt that it was okay to hold her hand or touch her shoulder platonically or as a family. Older men aren't touched at
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So then there's a kind of the flip side of this, which is then when aging becomes so, how often is it about perhaps avoidance, so, this is just me aging, like get over it. I'm now 50. I'm not interested. And in your experience, how much is it really sort of just about avoidance almost, or or
Yes.
or misinformation?
Well, misinformation for sure. So one of the problems with the ageism side of things and our culture and our difficulty with talking about sex is that this is research based, people don't people don't tell their partners that things have changed for them. And now if it's a person with a penis, any change is tends to be visible because erection might be lost or um, if there's a shift in their interest in sex, it might be really evident. For people with vulvas and vaginas, the loss of lubrication or the increase of chance of pain isn't necessarily visible. And it's not untypical for people to not tell their partners that things are becoming problematic. So people put up with painful sex and then gradually avoid sex. You're going to avoid anything that hurts. It's human. So that, not feeling able to communicate all the weight of ageism is a major issue. But in terms of avoidance, it's a helpful strategy. It's, why do we avoid things? 'Cause we don't want to do them or we don't like them or they're causing us distress. So I don't judge avoidance. I want to understand what's in it for the person. My kind of way I understand shifts in desire for longer term partners. I'm really interested in, is this a shift in desire in general? Is it a shift in desire for the partner you're with? And that's a very hard thing to say. You can still deeply love someone, but be put off having sex with them because you've had sex for years, gone off that side of it with them, but you'd quite like to have sex with someone else.
Yes, yes, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Again, my mind's whirring, but I'm not going to go there because I'm going to take up too much time. Um, we talk about sexual invisibility, Julie. What does that do to, I suppose, women particularly? Emotionally and relationally, that invisibility that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that comes for all genders. It's amplified for women because, as we've said, it matches um, the increased lack of visibility or interest that older people have in society, that older people are treated as being less relevant the older they get, rather than in white Western culture. It's not the same in other cultures. It's very important to just presume that this is universal, because people who age, including women in different cultures, are treated with more reverence as they get older. But in if I use the term white Western, certainly white British, um, that isn't the case. And I think even with the um, the narratives being different between men and women, even men, older men, when there's a certain age point, or have a similar kind of experience of feeling less, being treated as less.
Mm,
So it goes
yes.
with our culture, goes with ageism. Um, the other bit that invisibility brings up for me is um, sexual desires that haven't been expressed and that are invisible because of the way a person's partnered. So it brings up for me what we'd call in our profession as bi erasure or pan erasure, where people have a lifelong sexual interest in two or more genders, but they partner because of our monogamy code or their monogamy code, partner with one person, and that's how their sexuality is defined. It's that a part of them is invisible, and as the less chance there is to experience that other part of people.
Yeah, and I really resonate with that on a personal and professional level. That was, again, as a bisexual woman, um wanting and choosing to move into a monogamous and looking like a heteronormative, that part of my identity very much cut away. And certainly I work with lots of people, that are going through that process as well. But I think it's a really, really important point, and leads on to, I suppose, another really important element which we've touched on, which is how do you feel that kind of sexual aging shows up differently, perhaps in LGBTQ plus communities, trans communities. We talked before, didn't we, about um gay community, queer community, like, yeah, what's your take and thought processes on that? I'd be really interested.
Yeah, I mean, I want to start by saying it's not possible for any of us to speak in a representative way for any identity, isn't it? And I think the first thing I want to say is that if we think of LGBTQ plus, each of those identities is going to have um, different implications because of the the culture that goes with each of those identities. And then add in the specific individuals, and it becomes really quite personal, doesn't it? So I don't want to ever suggest I can speak on behalf of a whole range of people's kinds of things that come up are again culturally specific. So appearance might be amplified in some sexual orientation cultures than others. Um, my friends and colleagues who are trans identified can see advantages and disadvantages in aging. Advantages, how aging can actually support their experience of passing, um, and also worries about memory loss and where that takes a person in terms of their identities, and about what happens if you access care. So if you're partnered if your partner does swore, then that's a privilege or not, depending on your relationship. But if you're
Yeah.
and your relationship is perceived to be heterosexual, there's no question about your partner being with you in a care home or visiting you at in hospital. Now, things have changed a lot since I was younger around these themes, but still that edge of worry for people who are not heterosexual or whose relationships are not heterosexual presenting, whether their relationships will be honoured and respected when, when care is needed. And that for me is really, really heart wrenching.
Yeah. Yeah, that's and yeah, so important to recognize and to acknowledge, the reality of that, the lived experience of that. The other big sort of, topic, and I appreciate, of course, like you don't want to talk about individuals. I can't talk for individuals. We, of course, we don't, we don't know. But I suppose there is something about what we were talking about earlier, which is sort of heteronormative, misogynistic potentially ideas about male and female and roles in that. And I suppose there's a maybe an assumption, but maybe an assumption in a same-sex couple, that there might be a bit more ease with the aging process because they're not, they're not at a disconnect with one another. But again, that's an assumption and might not be the reality.
Yeah.
Um,
I think
you know,
different factors apply, I think
yeah,
you think about what could this be like for two gay men? It's going to be a different experience for lesbian women or sexual or pansexual people with their choice of partner. It's complicated, isn't it?
It's really, yeah, it's really, really complicated. Um, and the other part of kind of aging, which is one that I wanted to talk to you about, was age gaps.
Oh yes, yeah.
um, and I am, again, I'll sort of bring my sort of personal experience in. I mean, I'm a serial age gapper. I am a serial older woman. um, my current partner is 15 years my junior, and my previous husband was 12 years my junior. So I've spent kind of the last 25 years or something in an age gap relationship. Um, so I sort of wanted to talk about maybe what, in your experience, makes age gap relationships actually work well, as opposed to the negative but connotations of them, which we often hear about.
We hear about negative or there's judgment when the woman's
Yeah, the woman. Yeah, exactly.
although
Yeah,
the cougar kind of idea kind of reclaims at least some of the sexual energy in it, but it's still a judgment, isn't it? So there's definitely gender judgment. I think age gap relationships, the things that make them work are exactly the same things that make any relationship work. That you're matched in terms of your values, in terms of your desires for life, adventure or not adventure, or sexual adventurousness or not. Sense of humor, which I think is a, a deal breaker for a lot of people if they don't have that shared sense of humor in their relationship. So I think sometimes it's nothing more complicated than you love who you love and you fancy who you fancy, and age is. I think there's something in this about the match of moments in life for people. There's just a match of one person's needs and desires matching the other person's stage of life and vice versa. So I can, uh, some of the expectations that come with being older, like being, I don't know, steadier and more based, which is lovely and pleasurable for some people, but not on the map for others. Might wonder. So if you take a 50-year-old woman matching with a 50-year-old man, they might be exactly the right match for each other because they're still adventurous or they're not adventurous or whatever these things mean. But if you've got somebody whose interests and desires in life better match those of someone who's younger, that's the magic. I don't know. I find yeah, I think most things are just boringly weighed down by social expectations and unexamined narratives that just get on my nerves, quite frankly. And I'm just thinking,
Yeah. I totally hear you, but I'm also trying to question myself and be really honest with myself and say, is it just about lined up values and, we get on and we get on and you love who you love? There is something for me about youth.
I think I'm glad
You
you've been
know,
courageous and
I'm like I need like I have to be honest about that. I maybe want to stay youthful, or I'm more attracted to youth, which is exactly what we're talking about. About being honest with yourself about um do I have those my own ideas and negative ideas about aging, you know? And I don't want to go there. I don't want to go, and how is that linked to my existentialism, to my endings, to my so am I trying to stay somewhere that keeps me eternally young? I need to think on that. But
I think no, I think that I think that's really valid, and I'm really uh, grateful and pleased that you're able to name it. I wouldn't claim, I wouldn't feel able to claim that kind of narrative or present that narrative because it's outside of my broader lived experience. But I think if we think about an older man and a younger woman, there's an inbuilt understanding that there's a presumption that that older man is finding a youthful woman's body more and person more attractive. And of course, why wouldn't that work the other way around? Why would the woman find a younger man more sexually appealing? Why wouldn't that? And of course, that goes to the heart of the whole experience of being a human, which is this confounding experience that we know we're going to die, but we don't know when. I mean, that's a rough deal.
that's a really rough deal. I know.
I'd rather
And
not
on that note,
know.
and on
Yeah.
that note, we're finished. We're all gonna die and we don't know when. Um,
Hooray!
um, I suppose when what does kind of thinking about sort of actually the work, and the body of work that we're doing, what does good sex look like, later in life when, for whatever reason performance drops? Because obviously, I talk about this as I reframe, again, trying to reframe or it's contextualizing, and what do both people want from that? And it's okay to let go of some of those ideas, and it's okay to build a new era, and it's okay, and actually maybe liberating, maybe exciting to do that. Maybe there's maybe this is more about touch. Maybe this becomes more about, it does become about real experimentation. Who knows? But maybe it's a softer, gentler version, and that's all right too. We don't have to be necessarily having, sex 4 times a week still every week. And if you're not having that, then there's something terribly wrong, and you need to be, keeping at that bar. It's all right to say, I want something different, you know? But yeah, what's your take and thoughts?
Yeah, so I think again, some of that applies to the whole of our sexual lives. You know that almost lesson 101 of a sex therapist training is that heterosexual norms of penetrative sex meaning sex. We question that immediately.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
we knock penetrative sex off its perch immediately as sex therapists, don't we? We immediately question that and think of sex being a much broader, expansive experience than a penis going in a vagina or a penis going in a mouth or an anus, you know? Um, so that that um, thinking is helpful across your whole sexual life because it really helps to acknowledge the value of everything that we do with our partners. I define sex with when I'm working with couples, I'll say, regardless of whether they're monogamous or have open relationships, I'll say sex is anything that you do together that you'd be in trouble for with doing with someone else without it being communicated. So that can mean a stroke on the neck or a touch in the lower back, all of those kinds of things. So there's that. It's dropping the hierarchical standard of penetrative sex. Um, for me, the opportunity in that is the deepening of the experience. Yes, orgasms are lovely. People that have orgasms are generally experienced to be relatively nice thing to do. Yes, penetrative sex is lovely for some people, never lovely for others. But that deepening of sensuality and connection, I think, aging is a big invitation to that. Having time to spend touching one another and being with one another in that kind of intimate way. All the things we hope for ourselves, that we care less about standards and we care, as in expectations. We care less, we've got more time, we're more in the moment. Let's just hope for that for us. In terms of what we do as sex therapists, there's a lot that we can offer. There's a lot that's available sexual medicine wise to help people continue to be functional sexually for longer. And that should never be judged or minimized or uh, ignored. Go to the doctor, think about PDE5 inhibitors, lubricants, hormone treatments. It's good for overall health, it's not just sexual health. Um, and switching the sensory focus potentially away from visual being erotic, because that might be something that's been your main access to eroticism, and that's affected by your sense of your own body or your partner's, to taste and touch and smell and sound, just moving around the senses.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really beautiful point, That's yeah, absolutely. We're sort of coming to nearing the end. But what has aging sort of taught you about sex, do you think, that kind of no training ever could?
um, hmm, I think because it's quite difficult to separate out my personal experience from my professional life in that awarenesses that I don't know if I'd have had if I wasn't a professional.
Yes. Yeah,
Sexual
exactly.
therapist. So, I'm unpacking social norms for a day job, and that's not your average person's perspective. So it means that my own personal experiences inform my work, and my work informs my personal experiences. Because I've been a therapist since my um, early 40s. So the whole getting older as a person stage has been supported or aligned with being a psychotherapist. So that's to kind of switch the chicken and egg around that. Um, what I will say though is how important it is to uh, acknowledge when there's something that happens, that when sexual function or pleasure changes, do something about it, talk about it, because even though I do this for a living, I was delayed myself in addressing in my life changes. I was delayed, and I do this for a living. So if that really underlines for me how hard it can to talk to partners, because you don't want to hurt your partner or partners. You don't want to say something that's been absolutely lovely for 20 years is no longer lovely. You're struggling with your own sense of self, and is this real, and what's happening, and what does this mean? We all live stupidly busy lives where going to a GP or getting advice is hard because we don't have time. I would just say, if anything changes, notice it and get some support. Go to your GP if you're feeling pain. Talk to your partner. And if you can't, then talk to a professional who will help you talk to your partner.
Yeah.
It's that, that there are life threatening things that are indicated by sexual function changes. Don't, ig- don't ignore them. And don't presume that just getting older means the whole thing has to go in the bin. The
Mm-mm.
whole sex thing has to go in the bin. No, it doesn't. Get it straight out the bin.
Yeah, yeah,
You know,
yeah. I'm with it. Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you. So before we finish, what would you want kind of listeners to know about sex and aging? What would be your closing on that?
that it's not inevitable that your interest in sex declines, that your interest in sex and your ability to have different types of sex might change. but that there are lots of medical supports and psychological supports for that. Um, I'm a believer in, people find living their own life without judgment. So sex has never been your thing. Great, liberate yourself from the bother of it. And if sex has always been your thing, yeah, stay in it then, stay in it if you can. There's that kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
thought.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Julie, it's been absolutely so brilliant to have you on, and a real pleasure. And I've got to say, you've just got the most calming, lovely voice as well. You can really, I really tune into it because I like so I really, really appreciate you've been absolutely wonderful, and so much information, so much insight, so much knowledge, so much expertise. Thank you.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me.